don't assume, get curious, ask the person what it's like living with epilepsy, what it's like living with Crohn's, what it's like living with whatever, and learn as much as you can about it, because otherwise it's, it's sort of this black box, and it's, you have assumptions about what it is. Just because you saw someone have a seizure in the subway, or you had a friend who had Crohn's disease, right? Get curious is my biggest thing. Like, really try to understand what it's like.
Imagine this. You have your first few seizures and people tell you not to share your diagnosis of epilepsy because they're afraid for you. Afraid of the potential shame and discrimination you might face. While this is well-intentioned, you decide to do the opposite. Hey, Tim here, and thanks for tuning into another episode of the Invisible Condition podcast, where we talk about advocacy and unusually normal things, the conditions, diseases, and illnesses we live with. We will end the stigma of invisible conditions by empowering voices and educating others, and today's voice is brought to us by Jon Tuteur. With more than 500 seizures and 3 brain surgeries, we will hear a story that resonates with everyone who lives with an invisible condition. A story of hope, struggle, fear, and resilience. Jon has a book coming out soon called Seizing Today, Discovering Purpose and Authenticity in a Life-Changing Diagnosis. We talk about the few stories in this book, and I can't wait for you to hear them. Have a listen. All right, Jon, I am excited to connect with you. We connected, feels like months ago now. I think it was months ago. And we had a great conversation about your upcoming book, Seizing Today, Discovering Purpose and Authenticity in a Life-Changing Diagnosis. We're going to get into that, but I want to start off with asking you about, your condition. You've had more than 500 seizures, 3 brain surgeries, 15 holes in your skull, all after the age of 30. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I had my first seizure at 30, just completely out of the blue. A lot of people said, "What was your life like before that?" Pretty normal. And then, here's this just crazy thing that happened that at first we didn't even really know what was happening, because the first couple of seizures the first seizure no one saw. But it's been quite a journey around just medication and learning about the brain and how all this works, and diving into supporting the cause. It's brought a lot of positives to my life, in addition to the significant challenges associated with it. So that's, there've been a lot of silver linings.
Yeah, silver linings. And that's a great outlook. Did you always have that outlook? After seizure 1, 2, 3, 4, was it like, what in the world is going on to where you are today with 500 seizures later, you're doing well and having a different outlook on your condition?
As I was writing the book, and I've been working on it for 2.5 years, I'm reflecting back on my mindset 16, almost 17 years ago now. I really don't think I ever had I never went down this rabbit hole of this is awful. Why me? What am I going to do about this? I always really tried to focus on the positives, because what good was it going to do me to focus on the negatives, right? Yes, there are always times when it's harder and more challenging to stay positive, but for the most part, I think I've been able to do that over this period of time. It's just the way my mind works.
I think it's a great mindset to have. My listeners know I live with a chronic and invisible condition called Crohn's, and there are days where it's like, why is this happening? But what purpose does that serve, except for maybe an excuse to take the day off and watch Netflix or something like that? But that's just for me. I can speak from my experience. And you had multiple brain surgeries. How are you doing now? How are you doing today?
Really appreciate you asking. 2.5 years later, after the 3rd brain surgery, I feel really good. it took time to get there. One of the stories I talk about in the book is, my neurosurgeon said after the third brain surgery, it'll take you about 2 or 3 weeks to recover. It took a lot longer than that. It was a good year before I started feeling back to myself. And now I think definitely back there. Feel really good. Nothing's really kind of off limits. Driving again, all good things. Doing everything with my kids. So yeah, all very positive right now.
It's taken you a lot longer. Your surgeon's like, oh, a couple weeks, and it took you almost a year. What did it look like for you? That 3-week mark. What did you look like then compared to now?
It's funny because when we were talking about the recovery, he said to me, plan to take 2 to 3 weeks off from work. And I said, how about one? Like, joking, but also serious. And he, neurosurgeons are pretty straightforward people. He was not joking with me. He said, Jon, you're going to get a heavy dose of steroids. You're going to be exhausted. You're going to need to take that much time off from work. I still didn't really believe him. And I said something like, well, if the steroids are going to keep me awake, then I can just work more.
I love that positive. It's like, well, I might as well use this time.
Right, totally. And and so, yeah, after the 3 weeks, I was just exhausted. I was falling asleep in the middle of the day. I was taking really long naps. I didn't have energy. Like, I just felt totally off, not sick, but just drained of energy. To the point where I actually reached out to him and said, hey, something's wrong here. Like, what do you suggest? And he asked me to be admitted again. I went back to Johns Hopkins, and they did a whole bunch of tests, and everything sort of came back normal, which was good because his concern was, there could be bleeding in my brain or significant swelling or something else going on. But while I was there, then he tells me, and I love him to death, and he's incredible. This is not meant to be disparaging. I just think it's kind of funny to look back on now. He says to me, I've had 2 patients recently that, kind of similar situation to you, and it really took them close to a year before they felt, back to themselves. And I was like, well, that would have been helpful information for you to share with me in the beginning. You're telling me 2 or 3 weeks, and now, I laugh about that now because, I set this expectation in my head, like, okay, 3 weeks, I'm going to be back to work and everything's going to be normal. And
3 weeks is very different than 52 weeks. That's quite a gap. And I can relate. I had surgery last year, and the doctor said, oh, about 6 weeks, you should be back at it. And I was going back through emails and just, when did I try to get back at it? And I think it was like week 3. I'm like, oh, I'm fine. I couldn't really sit at my desk because I cut my abs completely in half. But I was determined and ended up pushing myself way too hard and had massive setbacks. And so it's almost like the opposite, where 3 weeks, you're like, oh man, what's happening? I'm like, hey, 6 weeks, no way. I could cut that down by, 5.5. We try, we might physically feel okay, but our bodies need to heal, and it takes time, and we're all different, aren't we?
Another thing he said to me to that point that really helped me visualize it, he said to me, listen, you've had 3 brain surgeries in a matter of a couple of months with significant amounts of anesthesia. Each of those procedures was over 4 hours. That's a lot of anesthesia. And the anesthesia was, that was part of what was causing the exhaustion. But again, I didn't have that information up front. But when he explained it, then I was like, okay, that makes sense, right? You're in my head, in my brain, three different times in a really short period of time, and lots of drugs, not just anesthesia, right? It's gonna take some time, but again, the expectation was totally different. If you had said it was a year up front, it would have been it just would have been a different experience. But anyway,
Is there plan for more surgery, or is 3 enough? You're on that path of like, I'm good now.
oh, Tim, I just want to keep having surgeries, of course. I mean, let's break some records here. Yeah, no, I certainly hope that this is it. Since you brought it up, I was having a conversation with my neurologist after the surgery, and he was sharing with me sort of the research that they've done around this particular procedure, laser ablation surgery, which is still a relatively new surgery. And they're seeing that after about 10 years, the efficacy starts to wear off. So there are patients that have had to have more surgery after around that 10-year mark. So that's always going to be in the back of my head now that he's shared that with me, but I certainly hope this is it.
Yeah. And you've got 10 years of a lot of life to live before another surgery. And just think of the medical advancements between now and then. It's going to be a completely different experience. But through all of this, you've had multiple MRIs in your life. I've had a few. They can be scary, right? This big, obnoxious machine. What is your experience with MRIs? Do they scare you? Are they like, walk in the park now? Let's do it. And I know that there's a standard list of questions, and we kind of had some fun with this in the pre-show. So talk to us a little bit about your MRI experience.
Yeah, I actually have a chapter in my book. I think I shared this with you. I call it the Brain MRI Concert. Because yes, it is just a fascinating experience. If you haven't, I know you have, but for listeners who haven't, it's sort of like what I liken it to is being alive in a coffin. Just completely enclosed, and it's literally sounds like jackhammering. It's just really loud, unpleasant noises. And they give you sound canceling headphones. And did you have this experience? They actually asked me what kind of music I'd like to listen to. So I thought about it for a while, and like, maybe I'll be able to fall asleep in here. It's Van Morrison, something soft. It's the noises from the machine are so loud, I couldn't make out what the music was at all. It could have been anything. I still wouldn't have heard it. So it's just not a pleasant experience. But I'm not claustrophobic. Thankfully, if people are, I can see how it'd be a really, really hard experience for sure. But I just dealt with the headache and moved on.
Just move on. But it was significant enough to write a chapter, and I'm guessing in that chapter is maybe some tips, or just even from your experience. If somebody's going for an MRI, never been, what is something that you would tell someone?
Well, first, you alluded to it earlier. I'll address it now. Just the questions that they ask are just fascinating, and so that's also in the chapter. But one of which is foreign objects that may be implanted in your body, and some of them are a little bit uncomfortable to listen to, and it's just sort of like, well, you're doing a brain MRI. Why are we focused on objects that might be implanted in parts lower in my body? But again, if you can't laugh about it, right? So I try to see the humor in all these things. It's just being prepared for it. Just it's just not a pleasant experience, but it's certainly better than brain surgery. It's certainly better than having your abs opened up and having intestines removed, or all these other things that we have to go through. So yeah, it's not fun, but there's much worse things.
there's a lot of not fun procedures. I know, we had a good chat about colonoscopies. We won't go there today, but good chat about colonoscopies. We think about procedures that aren't fun. That's I think on the top of my list.
Yes.
But around epilepsy, for those who are listening, for those who might not know what epilepsy is, can you talk to us about your definition of epilepsy? And there's so much stigma attached around it. Let's go there. Let's have a definition or define what it is.
There's sort of a technical definition of epilepsy, a medical definition. I'm just give you mine. So it's sort of electrical storms in your brain. Your neurons are firing in ways that they shouldn't be, and that's causing the electrical activity is causing the seizures to originate. And there so many, big part of it is doctors still don't know why in a lot of cases. Yes, there are specific causes for epilepsy. Traumatic brain injury is one of the common ones. But you go through that list, I go through that list, like none of that, I've never experienced any of that. And to this day, we don't know why suddenly at 30 out of the blue, like nothing else had happened in my life that, would make sense to trigger that. And so it's called idiopathic or cryptogenic epilepsy when you don't know what the cause is. We have a hypothesis, which I think I shared with you, if that's helpful to share. So I'm a triplet, as I mentioned, and my mom is 5'1", so having 3 babies in her tiny belly, we were knocking around in there, I'm sure. But even more interesting, my sister wasn't getting enough nourishment from her placenta, so she grew a vein from her to me and was feeding off of me. And in essence, I saved her life, and I like to remind her of that. When they cut the vein, when they opened my mom up, and they cut the vein, I started to bleed out. Had to have a blood transfusion. Had to stay in the NICU for I think 3 weeks. And so I think it's fair to categorize that whole event those events as trauma in the womb. And so my neurologist said certainly plausible, but we'll never know, right? There's no way of knowing, but we'll go with that one.
Wow. Yeah. So no known necessarily cause, some plausible explanation. 30 years old, having seizures. Again, like we said, multiple surgeries. What stigma did you face, and even stigma that maybe you put on yourself, or stigma that you've heard or have actually been part of?
Yeah. One of my favorite stories, and I think I shared this one with you. I was at Epilepsy Foundation conference a couple of years ago, and I met a pediatric epileptologist, and he was telling me a story about a patient of his who came in with his mother, and they were, just talking about how he's doing, and the mother looks at him and says, "Hey, we're going to take little Davy to church on Sunday for an exorcism." And the doctor's like, no. Just because he's having seizures doesn't mean he's possessed by the devil. And this conversation was in 2021 in the United States. It is there. So there are still people who believe that, which I was shocked by, but it's still out there. I know further back, if you look at Tony Coelho, who was the primary writer of the ADA and had epilepsy himself, he really experienced a lot of discrimination and stigma. Back when he was a child, I think we're past some of that, but there's still a lot of misconceptions about what it is. And, a lot of people in my life, when I was first diagnosed, said, do not talk about it. Do not talk about it. For fear that, could impact, my employer could do something, or, not, take me off of a certain path. Or, I mean, there've been a lot of people whose jobs have been impacted because of seizures. And I took that advice for a while, but a number of years later, I sort of went the opposite way. I'm like, I have to talk about this. Like, if we don't talk about it, then we're never going to be able to eliminate the stigma. I'm just open about it. I'm as open about it as I can be, and share it with as many people as I can. And what I find is when I do that, more and more people are like, well, I know someone. Actually, my son, and, we have made some incredible connections with people just by sharing that information, right? Holding it inside is just, it's not gonna help any.
It doesn't. It helps no one, not even yourself or me. If I hold it in, it helps no one. Somebody reached out to me recently and was a fan of the podcast, knows I live with Crohn's. They sent me a note and said, "Hey, I'm going through a diagnosis. We think it's Crohn's. Can we talk?" Absolutely. Right. Imagine, I didn't share, or you didn't share about having seizures. How could you have, you couldn't have those conversations. How did that feel to, for years, just not share? How did that affect you?
I mean, there were still people in my life, of course, that knew. Two of my first 3 seizures happened at work, so people at work did know, and were very supportive. I was very lucky to work at a company that just cared so much about their people, and were not, did not discriminate for, about anything at all. In fact, if anything, they encouraged me to do more. And, they were very supportive of the cause. This Accenture was the company that I worked for at the time. So anyone listening from Accenture, I still love you guys. So that was great. But, one of the interesting things along the way was sort of related to this was dating, because when I was 30 and I had my first surgery, I didn't, I wasn't married, I wasn't dating anyone, and so having that conversation, and when to have that conversation, and what the reaction is going to be, was always an interesting experience as well. But for the most part, I was lucky that I didn't experience firsthand much discrimination. But I know many people who have, sadly.
It's sharing a very vulnerable piece of yourself. And sometimes we're kind of forced to share when things happen in the workplace, or happen when we're out with friends. And like you said, you've had 2 seizures at the workplace. You can't hide that. It's happening. And it needs to have a conversation. And I'm so grateful that your employer at the time was accommodating, because I know that's not the case. I was talking with somebody the week as we're recording this, who is fearful to share, because they know, based on the history of their employer, that their employer will not care, will not put in any accommodations, and will likely get let go if they bring it up. So there's so much fear. And like you said, Jon, we need to talk about this. Like, I just, this image of like a revolt almost in the workplace, where we're just saying, what, this is me. This is my normal. I didn't choose to live with, fill in the blank. So accept me. And it's hard, isn't it, when we think about advocacy?
Yeah. Yeah. And, that's, as I mentioned to you earlier, I've changed, the title of my book has changed multiple times. And from what I'm told, that's fairly common. But the word authenticity is very intentional. How do we live authentically if we're not talking about the things that impact us the most, that have, that impact our families and everyone around us, so that was a big part of it for me, right? I wasn't living authentically by hiding it. So yes, I am a big believer in we have to have these kinds of conversations at work, wherever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for those who are listening, who still think an exorcism will cure epilepsy, no, you're wrong. Like 100% wrong. Uh, I was doing a Google search earlier before recording this just to see the results that come up, and yeah, there's results from very recent in chat rooms. But I also know in some countries, and I've heard this also firsthand in some countries, that there's still common practice where if you have a seizure, that you're brought to a spiritual practitioner or a church or whatever
Yeah.
it is, to get examined rather than a doctor.
Yep.
And yeah, that to me it's scary.
Yeah. Yeah. Very scary.
We talk about here in Invisible Condition, we talk a lot about self-advocacy, because I think, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of fear we have to overcome. And I believe that's all part of our journey of advocacy. How did you advocate for yourself? You've had seizures in the workplace, multiple seizures, successful surgeries. Talk to us a little bit about your journey of self-advocacy.
I always, giving back was always a value of mine. And, I credit my parents for that because they were a great role model in terms of what they did in the community. But I was always looking for what was going to make me the most passionate, because I tried a bunch of different causes, and I just hadn't found it yet. And once I was diagnosed, again, this is the power of positivity and just where my mind went, like, I want to get involved in this cause, right? I'm not going to spend my energy on feeling sorry for myself or worrying about what could possibly happen. I'm going to go try and help find a cure or help people who are going through this live better lives. And so I got involved with the Epilepsy Foundation of America, right after I was diagnosed, and have done countless things for them. And Cure Epilepsy, Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy is another phenomenal epilepsy foundation. They're specifically focused on research and finding a cure, whereas the Epilepsy Foundation does a lot of other things. But two wonderful organizations that I've been lucky enough to do work with. There were times where I'd work a long day at work, and then I would drive out to the Epilepsy Foundation's offices and spend 3 more hours with them. So yeah, that was really important to me, and hopefully it made a difference somewhere along the line. But from an advocacy standpoint, it was hard for me to not be involved, and advocate for myself. Like I really needed to dive into it.
This podcast is supported by StoriedWork.com. Do you ever struggle to get your thoughts written down in a clear and structured way? I often do. And when I'm planning my podcast scripts or articles, I have so many ideas in my head and I struggle to get them organized in writing. With Storied, all I need to do is speak in my thoughts and the tool automatically organizes my ideas. I love it because it provides feedback and prompts me to fill in any gaps to make my message crystal clear. Storied was founded by a dyslexic physicist who needed a new kind of tool to write. What their team discovered was that seeing your thoughts and ideas turn into clearly structured text unlocks potential for almost everyone. If you're having trouble translating your thoughts into clearly written content, such as articles or social posts, try Storied for free. Go to StoriedWork.com. Well, I know for many, finding their voice is hard. Overcoming that fear and that shame is maybe never goes away. It's something that is always there. And for you, what I'm hearing is it was, okay, I'm diagnosed, right? You hid it for a while and then stepped out of that hiding into, well, this is what I live with. Joined and supported amazing organizations. For someone who is struggling to maybe find their words or find their voice, and advocate for themselves, what would you say to someone?
Yeah, there's just so much power in community and connection with people that are going through the same thing that you are. There are millions of people on this planet that have epilepsy, and when I meet people, it's so often like, well, I don't know anyone. Well, 1 in 26 people in the United States have epilepsy. There's a pretty good chance that you know someone, they just don't talk about it. But I found that the more I've talked about it, whether it's on social media or, through podcasts or articles I've written, the more people that reach out to me and the more people that feel comfortable talking about it and sharing their stories. I love it when someone reaches out to me out of the blue who I don't know. If I've posted something on LinkedIn and, it's a third connection, so it's a colleague of a colleague of a colleague, that's just so rewarding. And wow, I thought I was the only one, you get that, or, I just I didn't know there were even some of these options out there. So yeah, just finding your voice around it is so important. The shame, yeah, I mean, of course, we're all going to deal with that. We're all human. But again, I just really try to put that aside and focus on the gifts in it. And I know that's a hard thing for some people to say or to hear. But to me, I mean, there are gifts in all of these things. It's how do we figure out what they are? So I really try to put the shame aside.
It's important, right? It's important to acknowledge that emotion, that feeling of shame and fear, and stepping out into the world, and whether it's connecting, like you said, with a complete stranger, or if somebody's listening and is just wants to tell their story or struggling, reach out. Jon is a phenomenal resource. I'm here to help, and there's so much power in that story. And I hear this on almost every episode that I've recorded, almost 30 episodes now. It's almost taking that first step, but practice too. Somebody given advice of, write down what you want to say, what and why you want to say it. Understand the why behind the what. Practice in the mirror, practice with a good friend, because maybe you need to talk to that employer. Maybe they are more empathetic than we think. I would hope so. And there's protections. The ADA, there's protections in most countries for people with a disability. But, you became very public of like, hey, I live with epilepsy, to the point where, hey, I'm going to write a book. What was the motivation to write a book? And when somebody picks up your book, what are they gonna hear? What's that story that they're going to leave with?
Yeah, as I think I shared with you, this was not like a bucket list item for me. I always enjoyed English in school as a subject matter, and I've always loved books. But writing my own book was never a thought. But when you spend over 40 days and nights in the hospital, the mind tends to wander. And I just started taking notes on all of these crazy things that had happened over the previous 15-ish years. And when I finally got out of the hospital, I went to see a good friend who's in the literary world, and I ran the idea by him, and I love it. Connected me with some other people in the literary world, and next thing I know, I've got an annotated outline, and working with editors and a publisher, and 2.5 years later, here we are.
Wow.
It is certainly not, writing a book is not for the faint of heart by any means. But it's been such an incredible learning experience. And I just have to give a quick shout out to my editor, who, Tom Ketting, is just phenomenal. I just love him to death. A lot of people say you're going to hate your editor by the time you're done because they push you so hard, but he's I barely knew when we started, and he's going to be a lifelong friend. So it's been a really fun process.
I'm taking a note. Well, we'll definitely give him a shout out in the show notes as well. I've always, maybe it is a bucket list item for me, and I've now publicized this on numerous podcasts that I want to write a book. I think I've got 3 ideas in the works. One, my wife and I have actually started, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, and it's a book around uh, etiquette, what not to say to someone who has disclosed or has told you about their invisible condition. If there is something that maybe you've heard or that you would advise somebody to just don't say, what would that be?
I love this question, and for the listeners, you didn't prep me on this one, and I say that because what I'm going to reference, I'm a huge Brene Brown fan, and she has a video or a video on the distinction between empathy and sympathy. And one of the things she talks about in there is the worst thing you can say to someone who's down in the hole, who's really in a bad place, is at least. So like if someone says to you, my marriage broke up, well, at least you got married, right? Like,
That's not helpful.
I have Crohn's disease. Well, at least you're able to eat today, or whatever it might be, right? That's why that one just has stuck with me forever, because nothing good can come from whatever's going to follow at least, right? Like, I just had a miscarriage. Well, at least you got pregnant. How is that person going to feel, right?
Yeah, at least you could try again, or at least it's not worse, or name a quote unquote worse condition, or I mean maybe the book is just one page. Just don't say anything that starts with at least. That's oh man, I could I cringe because I'm sure I've said it, and I know I've said it. Words flow often quicker than we can catch them.
Totally.
What I say to people who've asked, what do I do? What do I say? I don't know what to say. Like, just don't say anything. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to be the hero of the story. You don't need to have something profound to offer. By you just listening and nodding and saying thank you for trusting me, man, that's enough.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. I think, in those moments, we feel like we have to do something or solve it or make the other person feel better. But that's serving us. That's not serving them, right? And in those moments, most of us, all we really want is for you to feel like you're supporting me, not trying to fix me, because whatever that is, it ain't going to be fixed like that, right? There's nothing that could possibly say that's going to fix that. But if you say, I hear you, I support you, I love you, do everything I can, I'm sorry, that's sort of everyone's initial reaction. And that doesn't offend me by any means. I mean, I've said at least before, I also say I'm sorry. But I think there's some more powerful things you can do or say in those moments than, I'm sorry. Being with the person.
I said I was a guest on a podcast recently, and what I said was, if you don't know what to say that. Thanks for trusting me with this. I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. Simple. I like that. At least, at least, hey, Jon, you've had 500 seizures. At least it wasn't 600.
Right. You've had 15 holes in your head. At least it wasn't 30.
At least it wasn't 30. That'd be interesting. That'd be but if it was, maybe it would be a different story now. Yeah, we could spiral in some strange and obscure ways if we just focus on the at least. Yep. And I could almost see, maybe we should do this. Just record just a fun a podcast one day. Is just how can we one up each other's at least.
I love it. I'm in.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be fun to just have even just 10 people and just go around and just one up each other's at least. I wonder where we would end. Okay, I'm going to take a note of this because I can see that in the works. That'd be some fun. Because when we talk about invisible conditions, we got to have some fun with it. There's humor in it. There's, as you said, right, you got to look at there's multiple sides to being diagnosed with something. And for you, it was, okay, I am going to look at this from a positive side and how can I make a difference? And, I ask this to all the guests as we wrap up. I'm here with Invisible Condition to end the stigma. How are we going to do this? How are we going to, aside from, releasing a podcast a week, what else comes to mind? How are we going to end the stigma of invisible conditions?
Continuing to talk about it, as we've already addressed, is such a big one. I think, and writing about it, I love that you're thinking about writing a book. I don't know if one of those three is around your condition. But, again, so this is one of my favorite things to talk about around human connection. My belief is that the biggest source of disconnection is assumptions. And we all do it, right? It's innate. But when we make assumptions, a lot of times we're wrong, right? Because we're making the assumption based on our perspective of the world. And so I think to answer that question, don't assume, get curious, ask the person what it's like living with epilepsy, what it's like living with Crohn's, what it's like living with whatever, and learn as much as you can about it, because otherwise it's, it's sort of this black box, and it's, you have assumptions about what it is. Just because you saw someone have a seizure in the subway, or you had a friend who had Crohn's disease, right? Get curious is my biggest thing. Like, really try to understand what it's like. And I have a chapter in my book that talks about what it feels like to have a seizure. And I did that intentionally because a lot of people, I think, have seen someone have a tonic-clonic seizure or a grand mal seizure, but what does it feel like to the person who's having it? And by the way, there's over 30 types of seizures. Most people think, a grand mal seizure or tonic-clonic seizure is the only type. There's over 30. But what is that experience like? Like, what does it feel like to have Crohn's disease? Like, what are you actually going through? Like, the feelings and the emotions, I think, are so important to express and to understand, because otherwise you can't fully understand what it's like, what that person's going through.
I love that you went there. You're speaking my language: curiosity, authenticity. What, before we wrap up real quick, is what does it feel like to have a seizure?
Yeah. So I have two types. So tonic-clonic, again, grand mal, what people typically think of, that you lose consciousness. So I'm not feeling anything during it, but after, very sore, because your muscles are clenching, your teeth are clenching. Like, I would just sore in places that I never expected to be, and you're foggy, brain foggy. It really takes a couple of days to recover from it. Like, the analogy I use in the book is, it's like writing with a dull pencil, right? And you start writing with a dull pencil, sometimes it's hard to read what it is that you're writing. And that's sort of what it's like, is there are certain things that typically are fairly easy to do that in that post-ictal state, the post-seizure state, are just harder, because your brain is working so hard and this electrical storm is going on. And depending upon your origination point, for me, my temporal lobe, which is where your memory functions are, where a lot of your executive functions live, like, memory was a huge impact. Right? I really struggled with memory after seizures. So the other type of seizure I have is what's called focal aware seizures. So I'm actually awake and I know what's happening. And there's three parts to it. I get this really bad smell, which I describe it in the book. I'm not going to take the time now to describe it because it's it's a hard one to describe, but it's a really nauseating smell. And then it's like this movie is playing in my head. I'm watching a scene from my life that happened previously. It's like a flashback. It's at first I called it deja vu, but it's not. I started really digging into, okay, what's the definition of deja vu versus flashback? It's really a flashback. Like I'm watching a scene from my life that has already happened while I'm standing there, sitting there. Like it's just wild. And then I get really sweaty, like on my hairline, and really nauseous. And then the movie projector turns off, and the seizure's over. Like I would bet that whoever's listening to this, that's probably really shocking. Like, really, that's what happens? Yes.
I'm for those who are listening and not watching, my jaws open a little bit. I would not. That's where curiosity comes in. If there's over 30 types of seizures, I think you think of seizure as portrayed in the movies, or as on shows, or what you might read in a book. But to have part of your life play, that is wow. Okay, I'm kind of a loss for words. And wow, thank you, Jon, for giving us a glimpse into your life.
Yeah.
And 3 surgeries later, I know you're doing so much better. And with this surgery, this latest one, hopefully there's more than a 10-year runway before another seizure happens. For those who are listening, there's a lot to learn with every condition. And Jon, I'm just grateful that our paths crossed, that we connected. You've got your book coming out. I can't wait to read it. When is it coming out? Where are people going to find it? I know we're going to link it in the show notes and we'll help spread the word when it's out. But where could people even reach you?
Yeah, so the book will be available on your typical sites, so Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's not available yet. It's looking like July-ish. I'll get a firm date in the next couple of weeks, but sometime in the summer, I think is a fair estimate. People can reach me. The best way to reach me is really through my LinkedIn. My handle is Jonathan-Tuteur, and I say this and I mean this, and I've had lots of people reach out to me, but please, if you're going through this, if you have questions, someone, you want to talk to someone, I promise you I will respond, and I want to help. There have been so many people that have reached out to me in the past 2.5 years. It's a joy for me. I wish that I had that when I was going through it myself. So please, don't hesitate to reach out. LinkedIn, that's the best place to get me.
Well, there you go, listeners. I'll have all the contacts in the show notes as well, so no worries on that. So please head to invisiblecondition.com and to this specific episode, and you'll see Jon's contact information there. Jon, it's a pleasure to have you on. And for those who are listening, if you want to help support end the stigma of invisible conditions, there's a couple ways you can do that. You could share this episode. You can share all the episodes out with friends, family, your coworkers, strangers, airdrop it to whoever is in your vicinity. That will help. Subscribe to the newsletter. We release a newsletter every 2 to 3 weeks, and that's growing exponentially. So thank you if you are subscribed. Right there on the newsletter, we just talk a little bit about what's happening with Invisible Condition, as well as update you on the episodes that are being released and all the content we are pushing out. And thirdly, if you have the means, please donate. Your donations go to shows like this and help produce shows like this. So we are a nonprofit, and we are pursuing charity status. And so here in Canada, so your donations go a long ways. Jon, it's been a pleasure. I'm sure we'll connect again, especially when your book is out. Let's chat again then, if not before. And thanks again for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. I really enjoyed this. This was great.
Yeah, for those who are listening, I hope you have a good one.